and good evening. I'm David Lehrer, and I'm pleased to welcome you to another session of Community Advocates Crossroads and Jews United for Democracy and Justice, America at a Crossroads series of town halls. I welcome you on behalf of my partner, Janice Kamener-Resnick, the president of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, and its executive committee, including Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Janice Kamener-Resnick, Rabbi Ken Chasen, Caroline Kelly, and me. Janice is out of internet contact tonight, but has been checking in on our progress. I let her know that we have nearly 4,700 registrants so far. Complementing last week's riveting discussion with the New York Times' Peter Baker, tonight we host his Times colleague, pundit par excellence, David Brooks, a rare treat. He returns for his third annual appearance on America at a Crossroads. Next week, we will continue our engagement with best-selling authors who have timely ideas to offer. We'll host Bill Browder, the author of Freezing Order, a gripping chronicle of how the Kremlin kleptocracy operates. Browder will recount what he has experienced and what its implications are for the West in dealing with Vladimir Putin. He'll be in dialogue with KCRW's Warren Only. The following week, we will have with us noted social psychologist Jonathan Haidt in conversation with scholar Rabbi Ed Feinstein. They will discuss the profound divisions in our society and whether we will ever be able to talk the same language again. The following weeks bring equally relevant topics: the implications of the Russo-Ukraine war with Ambassador Dennis Ross, extremism in America with U.S. Senator Gary Peters, chair of the Homeland Security Committee of the Senate, former presidential advisor David Gergen, former U.S. Ambassador to Moscow Mike McFaul, and many more. You'll receive emails about all of these programs as they approach. Now I welcome my good friend, a former member of the LA County Board of Supervisors and the LA City Council, a pillar of LA politics for nearly 5 decades, Zev Yaroslavsky. He'll introduce tonight's guest and our moderator. Zev?
Thank you, David. Thank you for dating me. And you missed one from Sydney, Australia, who we have visiting with us tonight. So welcome from down under. There doesn't, a day doesn't go by when I'm not asked or told what a great program this is and how many thoughtful and wonderful guests we have, and the moderators are great. And tonight will be that on steroids. We have one of the most thoughtful, incisive, perceptive pundits in America today, David Brooks, as our guest, and our super dean of moderators and talk show hosts in Southern California, Larry Mantle. David Brooks has been an op-ed columnist for the New York Times since 2003. He is also a weekly commentator on public on PBS NewsHour, Public Broadcasting System's NewsHour, National Public Radio's All Things Considered, and a regular on NBC's Meet the Press. To put it bluntly, if you care at all about public policy issues, you probably intersect with David Brooks at least once or twice a week, and especially on Sundays. He is a voice of reason and thoughtfulness, and a man with firm, discernible moral compass. We're honored to have him here tonight. And Larry Mantle of National Public Radio's KPCC has been the host of Air Talk since 1985, the longest running program on Southern California Public Radio. It is the station's flagship broadcast. Larry has been honored by his colleagues with numerous awards, including a Journalist of the Year and the Associated Press's Mark Twain Award. He is a friend and somebody I've known for many years, and we are very lucky to have him tonight as our moderator. I turn it over to you, Larry Mantle.
Zev, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm always honored to be a part of America at a Crossroads. I've known the organizers of this series for so many years, and to see all the work that they've put into public service and these kinds of civic conversations is just a wonderful feeling to see the success that has greeted them. Also, my thanks, of course, to Mel and to David, who I've also had the pleasure of knowing all these years. And now we've had more than 2 years of these programs, consistent growth in audience size and participation along the way. And I know tonight will be no different. I would just ask, when you ask your questions, if you would please include your first name and your location. It's just nice to share with others where a question is coming from and to put a name with the question. So just your first name and location, if you wouldn't mind, when you ask a question of our guest, David Brooks, this evening. Now, I know our given topic is authoritarianism, and we'll be talking a lot about that, but much of it will be, as opposed to an explicit conversation about that, all the other aspects of our culture and world economy that we're seeing are moving us in that direction toward authoritarianism here in the United States as well as internationally. So we're going to cover a lot of ground tonight, I'm sure including your questions as well. David, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's great to have this chance to talk with you. We've spoken about your books over the years on the program I host, Air Talk, and I'm so glad we have this chance to talk on America at a Crossroads.
You guys have gotten too big for me. I did this 3 years ago when you guys were just starting, and it was just like chatting with a few Jews in Los Angeles, and now you're a global enterprise, so I'm a little intimidated.
Oh, no reason to be. We're so glad to have you with us. 3 months ago, you wrote a column entitled "Globalization is Over, the Global Culture Wars Have Begun." You describe what was called convergence globalization. This is post-fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, a movement at the end of the Cold War that coupled growing prosperity with a buy-in on the values of freedom, human rights, and pluralism. So please elaborate on that model, what was sort of the intellectual consensus of what would follow the fall of the Soviet Union.
You know, if you remember, I was in the Soviet Union when Boris Yeltsin was elected Russian president, and the Soviet authorities, led by Gorbachev, tried to stage a coup. This was 1991, and they rolled tanks into Russia, into Moscow, and Yeltsin stood in front of the big Russian White House building, and he basically said, "Shoot me if you want to, but if you don't, the Soviet Union's over." And so when he did that, all the democratic protesters or activists came to surround Yeltsin to safeguard him. And I interviewed a woman there named Valentina Kosieva. She was 93. I met her when she was, and I asked her, "What's your life story?" She had been born, I think, in the household of the Tsar. So she was there before the revolution. She was nearly killed during the Russian Civil War that happened right after the revolution. Her first husband was sent off to the Gulag in the 30s and the purges. Her 2 kids were killed in the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. Her next husband was sent off to the Gulag in the 50s. She was part of the Kalmyk people, an ethnic group in Russia, and she was exiled by Khrushchev. So every bad thing that happened in Soviet history happened to this woman. And I see her at age 93 passing out sandwiches to the democratic protesters who are launching a democratic Russia. And this is 1991. And I was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in those days. And I not only covered that event, the end of communism, I covered the end of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa, the Oslo peace process in the Middle East. It just seemed like the barriers and violence of the world was coming to an end. And we were all converging. We were going to be part of one global economy. And that heyday lasted about maybe 10 years. The Yugoslav Civil War happened. We began to see ethnic violence. In the 20 years since, we've seen a decline in democracies, a decline in global trade, a decline in foreign investments. So all that convergence, we're now going in the opposite direction. And the most interesting thing I'll mention about that is the cultural divergence. We thought as we have the internet, we're all going to be one culture. And what's fascinating to me is that people around the world, like say your music tastes, people are now more likely to listen to music from their own country than they were 20 years ago. So far from being one global marketplace, we're now hiving off into a bunch of different national cultures. And the World Values Survey does this survey around the world of people's values about how they feel about individualism and family and things like that. And it used to be the world's values were coming together. Now the values of Europe and America are splitting off from the values of the rest of the world. We're just way more individualistic than they are. So instead of convergence, we're seeing economic divergence into different economic blocks, China here, Russia there, US here. We're seeing cultural divergence, and we're seeing values divergence. So the world is becoming less of a globalization world and more of a culture war world.
And how much do you think technology and even social media plays in that? Because I wonder if this is at least in part a response to the complexity of the world. People sense as they look out on the world and connected to it in a way they never used to be, that in a sense makes it easier to indulge grievances, to feel left out, and to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the world.
Yeah, well, this was totally counterintuitive. We all thought in the 90s, I can download a Korean K-pop song or a Russian song or a Chinese song instantly. And so we thought, oh, we're all going to be we're going to be tasting each other's cultures. We'll all get closer together. It reminded me of a time, this is a point the historian from Harvard, Neil Ferguson, has made. The printing press comes into being in the 16th century. They start printing books, and you think you're going to be able to trade books across cultures. There'll be peace and harmony. We'll all read each other's books. Instead, there were 200 years of vicious religious war. And so these technologies that we think are going to bring us together sometimes drive us apart. And I think that instead of it allowing people to interact with people completely unlike themselves, it's allowed people to silo within themselves. So you go to a PTA meeting in your own hometown, you're meeting with a diversity of people. You log on to whatever website is your favorite, you're communing with a homogeny of people.
Well, and how much then does this tap into our naturally wired sense of in-group and out-group, and how we perceive threat and security? And what does that mean for us trying to figure out a way out of insularity and in-group supremacy?
Yeah, so I don't think technology is the key driver here. Technology is the medium through which we express ourselves. And so I'm not a big believer that social media or the internet is really driving history here. To me, I'm a cultural determinist. I think culture and values really determine things. And the big change, especially in the United States, is the decline of social trust. And we've lost trust in our institutions a long, long time ago. But we only lost trust in each other over the last couple decades. So if you ask people a few decades ago, do you trust your neighbors? 60% of Americans said, yes, I trust my neighbors. Now it's 30%. And it's very age determined. The younger you go, the more distrusting people are. Only 19% of millennial and Gen Z trust their neighbors.
Wow.
And so as 73% of millennial and Gen Z believe people are basically selfish and out to take care of themselves. So if that's your view of the world, that the world around you is dangerous and filled with conflict and filled with threat, then you're going to hunker down, and you're going to use technology to do it, but you're going to use a lot of different ways to do it. And I think that's basically what's happened. A sense of menace has descended over the country, and that's fed by school shootings. That's fed by the words that we use to describe our era: microaggressions, cancel culture, safe spaces. You can just feel the sense of menace in the air. A friend of mine, Peggy Noonan, had a good line. People are proud of their bitterness now. My sister-in-law is a nurse, and she tries to keep her staff at her hospital. And they want to leave because the patients are getting more rude and more violent. I ran to a guy who's a hospital or a restaurant owner in New York. And he says, every week I have to throw somebody out of the restaurant for rude and behavior. And so this is part of a general sense that the world is dangerous. I need to hunker down with people like myself.
Now, I've attributed a lot of what you're describing with people's rude behavior to a COVID phenomenon and the psychological impact of COVID and anxiety from that. If this is a longer term trend, how does this fit into, back in the 1960s, we had terrible waves of crime and random shootings and assassinations, of course, and social unrest and divergence of values. So how did we get through that period in this country when we're facing at least some similarities today?
Yeah. but my editors have not been happy with this piece called "The 70s Were Worse." And that would be like, you look at 68 to 72, you had assassinations, you had 50,000 Americans killed in Vietnam, you had bombings on college, you had a lot of really bad stuff. The times were objectively worse in the 1960s and 70s. They were subjectively better. And what I mean by that is that in the 1960s and 70s, there was senators who could go to Richard Nixon and say, time for you to resign. There was also just a sense of the country, people basically trusted each other. And there wasn't what we have now, which was an emotional and relational crisis. You see the rise in suicides, the rise in depressions, the rise in number of families who 27% of Americans have broken with a member of their immediate family. The number of people who say they have no friends has quadrupled. So in measure after measure, our relational lives are worse than they were in the 60s and 70s. So there was some basic of social fabric that was holding together, and even in the tumult of the 60s and 70s, and that we do not have. Having said that, I do think we're going to pull out of it, but in a different way than we did back then.
Well, yeah, as a person of faith myself, I wonder if some of this can be attributed to more and more Americans not having religion at all as a part of their life. And for better or worse, you can argue that when you think your neighbor has some sort of religious values, that at least they're giving words to, whether they live the life according to that or not, that maybe that buys some sort of sense of commonality and to shared values, regardless of the faith that the person practices, but that there's some degree of commonality in that.
100% agree. So, one of the statistics that struck me is that for the fewer than 50% of Americans go to church, synagogue, or mosques. So it used to be most people were religious, and religious does two things. And aside from faith in the Almighty and spiritual life, let's say three things. One, community. It just, if you're in a congregation of whatever sort, it just brings you together with people, community. You have neighbors, you have friends, you have community. Two, spirituality. One of the strongest predictors, there's a neuroscientist, Lisa Miller, one of the strongest predictors of avoiding depression is having a rich spiritual life. People who have a rich spiritual life are just much, much less likely to suffer from depression, mental health issues. They've got a telos, a purpose in their lives. Three, moral formation. I'm a believer that we're beautifully made, but we're also deeply flawed and deeply sinful. And congregations, religions give you moral formation. They tell you how to be a good person. They give you a purpose in life. But even more specifically than that, they give you the rituals and practices and skills to know how to deal with other people. How do you sit with somebody who's suffering? How do you sit with somebody who's suffered a loss? How do you have a hard conversation? How do you tell the truth up to a person tactfully? How do you break up with somebody without crushing them? These are specific social skills. And in my view, and especially as someone who teaches college, these social skills and moral skills have not been transmitted. And so say the Jewish ritual after death, you would not think that if somebody loses a loved one, it's not intuitive. You would say, you should probably go to a party and host a party for the next 7 days. But the Jewish ritual of sitting Shiva is a brilliant way to handle grief. Gives people something to do. It brings the community together. It defines a certain sort of family life. And suddenly millions of people, not only the Jewish rituals, the Muslim rituals, the Christian rituals, are absent of all that. And so in my view, there's a formlessness to their life. And I see this in my students. There's a formlessness to how they date, how they hook up. And a lot of the rules that governed a lot of just normal life have been washed away for them. And so it's no wonder they find themselves in a lot of flux.
So in Europe, for example, they've gone down this road earlier than we have, that people who are disconnected from a faith life, that's been the majority there for a long time. What do we learn from their experience with that? What takes the place of that when it comes to values formation?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They've gone down that, but their culture is weirdly conservative, and so they're very much more communal than we are, much less in individualistic cultures. There are a set of rituals. I was just in Ireland, and you go to the pubs, and the life of pub culture, the life of male friends going out and having a beer together, that life still exists in the way it existed 100 years ago. It's just a much more stable culture. And they don't move as much as we do. And so I do think they've suffered a bit from secularization, mostly in their low fertility rates. But I don't perceive as much social chaos in where I've been recently, Ireland and France, because they are still very much rooted to their hometowns and the rituals of their hometown.
David, let's talk about how this anti-globalization movement, which we began our conversation talking about, how that's fed into authoritarianism. So with the rise in nationalism or even regionalism, people turning away from this sort of globalism, that we thought was going to come to the fore, convergence, globalization. How then does that feed the rise of the authoritarian state? And what does that psychologically offer people?
Well, so let's go back to 1991 in Russia. So I was an American correspondent, but I was surrounded by American economists. And the consensus view among American foreign policy people was we need to privatize the Soviet economy. And so if you went to a hard currency restaurant where all the Westerners ate and screamed, did anybody leave a privatization plan in the men's room? Everybody in the restaurant would get up and, oh, where's my privatization plan? Because everyone had one. What we did not appreciate was law and order. That we did not appreciate was the Russians were stealing everything in the country. The elite Russians were stealing. We did not appreciate how degrading and humiliating it was to see your system collapse. I once went into a hard currency restaurant where the Westerners would go, and there was a row of women on the wall. There were about 40 or 50 women, young, beautiful women. And I looked over, they were all prostitutes. And they were all from Moscow State, which is the elite university. And so a friend of mine said to me, we're plundering their timber, we're plundering their oil, and we're plundering their women. And that's just bound to be humiliating and feel morally wrong for a people. And so they were surrounded by corruption and chaos. And if you leave people surrounded by chaos, they will do anything to get out of chaos. And so if privatization was offering chaos and Vladimir Putin was offering stability, they were going to go with stability. And I think that's essentially part of what's happening around the world. And even the United States, people think there's chaos and they just want somebody to clamp down. And Donald Trump, I think, is a response to that. Viktor Orban is a response to that. In some way, Xi in China is a response to that. If liberalism is going to lead to a sense of existential insecurity, then people will say to hell with liberalism.
And so what can liberalism offer as the better alternative to the security that authoritarianism, at least early on, appears to offer?
Yeah, well, one thing is to point out that authoritarianism seems to offer security, but it really offers crushing conformity. And the big benefit liberalism has is that it is the only system that recognizes and celebrates the dignity of the individual. And so my basic view is if we're in a contest between liberalism and authoritarianism, which I think we are, both domestically and abroad, those of us who are liberals and proud liberals should have faith in our system. We should have faith that the authoritarianism in Russia is going to lead to massive stupidity, as we see in Ukraine, and massive cruelty. We should have faith in China that it's just going to be over the long term hard to run a country of 1 billion people from the center, that this idea of concentrating power inevitably leads to corruption, it leads to ignorance. It's just epistemologically impossible to run a system from the center. But liberalism needs a moral system that people can believe in and that can govern their lives. Liberalism fails when it tries to be morally neutral, when it tries to say, we're not going to take sides in moral issues. everybody can do what they want. This idea that everybody can develop their own morality, this is a very dangerous and foolish idea. You know, I give commencement talks and I look at other commencement talks, and well, we leave the next generation with a burden of debt, and then we give them a bunch of garbage advice so they'll never be able to pay it off. And one of those bits of garbage advice is, first, follow your passion. Like if you're 22, you don't know what your passion is. But the second is come up with your own values. If your name is Nietzsche or Aristotle, maybe you can come up with your own values. But for most of us, values are something we share as a people. And so if you're trying to come up with your own values, you're outside the realm of civilization as we know it. And unfortunately, that's a message we've given to a lot of sense of shared values, which run opposite to liberalism. Liberalism is about individual freedom. That's great. But there has to be a set of values that's also about belonging. And Jewish scientific community, which is secular. I don't care, you know, I do care, but I'm willing to tolerate a diversity of systems of belonging to push against the individual of capitalism and liberalism. And in our own minds, we need to have a piece of us that's liberal, that's individualist, that's about freedom. But we have to have another piece of us that pushes against belonging, that's about surrendering.
What is this call on our leaders to do? Because as we're talking about faith in the past, it was religious leaders who people would look to elaborate on norms from different scriptural works that people could look to. But you know, now we have an American culture war that progressives often attribute, you know, conservative cultural views to racism, or that people are being exclusionary. Conservatives feel forced into accepting a progressive worldview and vocabularies that come out of academia. And so how do we establish a way for progressives and conservatives to be able to move closer in shared values? Because at this point, seems to me that each demonizes the other and ascribes the worst possible motives to the other.
Yeah. Well, we certainly are surrounded by conflict entrepreneurs, people who make a lot of money doing this. And that's why we love NPR, because you guys don't do that. And so I would say, you know, I'm very instructed. If you take a country that's split apart, that has low trust, that has no trust in institutions, how does that country turn around? And so the best parallel from our own history, in American history, is America in the 1890s. So it was in the 1870s, we had economic chaos, we had waves of immigration, we had a big economic transformation, industrialization. It looked a bit like America today. And yet by 1910, they'd made great progress. How do they do it? It happened in three waves. The first was a cultural shift. In the 1880s, 1890s, the ethos of social Darwinism, which was very sharp-elbowed, every rugged individualism, was replaced by the ethos of the social gospel movement, which was about community and holding people together. Then in the 1890s, there was a civic renaissance. All sorts of community organizations and big organizations, from the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, the boys clubs and the girls clubs, the NAACP, the unions, the environmental movement, the settlement house movement. You had all these civic organizations rising up. And then later, at about 1900, you had the progressive movement. So you had a cultural movement that shifted the culture of the country. You had a civic movement, people creating community organizations to give a sense of belonging. And then later, you had a political movement to clean up the institutions. And that seems to me a very persuasive model of how change happens. Culture changes first, civic changes later, politics changes were last. So I don't look to Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi to lead a cultural renaissance in this country. I look to, you know, the voices around the country who are trying to forge a common sense of values and a common sense of belonging. And those are writers, those are philosophers, those are podcasters. And so I think change comes from the ground up. And I run this program, or I chair a program at the Aspen Institute called Weave. And Weave is about taking the people who are building trust at the local level. And so we support people who work in the neighborhoods that I live in, say, LA. I was in Watts and I ran across a woman named Keisha who runs something called Sisters of Watts. And she just provides showers to the homeless. She provides food to kids who need it. She does whatever the neighborhood needs. And that kind of person is building trust on the micro level. And if we can support people like that, then, and I can tell you from traveling around the country, those people are everywhere. And we just need to amplify their work. And I don't think trust is going to be rebuilt from the top down. It's going to be from the bottom up. And so I do believe we're in the middle of a civic renaissance. And I bet everybody on this call can point to organizations that are local, that are building trust, that are transforming the little culture around them so that kids and homeless people and the poor and everybody else can grow up with this sense of a shared community. And that's where I see my most hopeful signs.
David, you were talking earlier about how authoritarianism gives the illusion of security, but ends up, of course, being deeply repressive, and a forced homogeneity is the result. And do you see signs that here in the United States that Americans are turning away from the idea of seeking security in authoritarianism?
I see signs that Americans are turning away from Donald Trump. And I say that because I would say his candidates in the primaries, in the Republican primaries across the country, some of them have done well, J.D. Vance, but an awful lot have done poorly. And so I just think there's some sense among a lot of Republicans, and I would say this is true in my own contact circle, that they say, I'm not going to renounce Donald Trump, but maybe it's time to move on to the next guy. And there was a poll recently in New Hampshire that more Republicans support DeSantis, the Florida governor, than support Donald Trump. That was startling to me because that's not the kind of poll we've seen recently. So I do think there's some movement away from that. But this is a big global problem. And to me, the problem, one of the things that's so interesting to me is we often analyze our own politics just in terms of America. We're a big country, we're kind of insular, but there's a Donald Trump in almost every Western country. There's a Bernie Sanders in almost every Western country. There's frankly a Joe Biden in almost Western country, a sort of a moderate there in the middle. And why are all our politics sort of mirroring each other these days? My number one answer is that in each of our countries, there's a group of people who are 20% of the country, and I'm included, and probably a lot of people on this call are included, who are highly educated, who live in coastal places, who have tremendous cultural influences, have tremendous sometimes economic influence. And so a lot of people in all these countries take a look at people who live in the big cities, and they say those people have too much power, they condescend to us, they have too much cultural power, they have too much political power, screw them. And that sort of populism is feeding the authoritarianism in nation after nation, including in our own.
And what's the answer to that? Because that 20% is only growing with more people going to college, with there being more elites, for lack of a better term. So what then keeps that sort of resentment from growing along with that?
Yeah, well, it's a tough problem because one of the things that people in my social class do is that we invest an awful lot in our kids. And so Robert Putnam of Harvard had this statistic that the average college educated parent invests $5,000 a year per kid just in extracurricular activities. And then another guy, my colleague at Yale, Daniel Markovits, counted up all the amount of money invested by these parents in their kids total. And it's about $10 million. And so our kids then have tremendous advantages. They get into nice colleges. They marry other people who have tremendous advantages. They produce kids who get into nice colleges. I think a couple of things have to happen. One, incumbent on all of us, is to get out of our silos. I mean, I am paid to travel around the country and talk to Trump voters, and it's tremendously liberating. It's very hard to have disrespect for most of these people, I can guarantee you. And so to be fair to the people who are on the other cultural divide is the first thing. Second, I just think we need to change the way the meritocracy is structured so it gives outrageous advantages to people who live in upper middle class suburbs. And I teach at very fancy schools, and I can tell you, we don't have a lot of poor white kids from rural America. And, I work at very nice places, and we don't often draw from those places either. And so to me, the act of social integration is just an important act that's ahead of us, because if we tell people your voice doesn't matter, they're going to rebel. And that's a lot of what's happening.
Well, it also means you have to be willing to accept those individuals that aren't in the silo with you for who they are to some extent, because for you to just expect they're going to become like you, that's further condescension.
Yeah, I was at a Trump rally, this was years ago, maybe with 2016 or 2015. I think, if my memory serves, I ran into a woman who was a Trump supporter. She was a lesbian biker who'd converted to Sufi Islam after surviving a plane crash. I was like, what stereotype does she fit into? And I think you find that people generally do not fit into the stereotypes you think they're going to fit into. People's lives are just more complicated than that.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry, David. No. Please finish your thought.
Yeah, I'll just say one. I ran into a guy in South Dakota also years ago, and he was a big Trump supporter. He thought Trump was going to win at a time when I didn't think he was going to win. And he said, let me tell you why I'm supporting him. He's a jackass. But, my best job, this guy was about 70. My best job was when I was like 34. I was the foreman of a crew at a plant that created refrigeration systems that go above office buildings. And they changed the equipment. I was no longer qualified to be foreman, so they laid me off. And so I was just going to leave the building quietly. I just want to get away. So he packs up his stuff in his office. He opens the office door, and there are 3,600 people making a double line, a little tunnel between his office door and his car out in the parking lot. So he carries his box between this double line of people, and they're applauding him the whole way. And he says to me, that was the best day of my life. I felt the appreciation of all the people I worked with. And then he described to me every job he's had since. And every job was worse, low paying, more insecure, more degrading. And so he just said, I need to change, and I'm going to bet on this guy. And how do you quibble with a guy like that? You can't argue with his decision.
David, before we go to questions from viewers, just quickly, you've been critical before the first public hearing of the January 6th committee. You said the focus really needed to be more on avoiding efforts to delegitimize and overturn the results of future elections than going back over the past. Now we've had the chance to see several of the hearings, including the dramatic one that occurred last week. And I just wonder your thoughts about the hearings now. Do you think that there is high value in going back and looking at the activities of the former president and his inner circle?
Yeah, I think my core point was correct, that we do need to focus on who is controlling the state legislatures, what are they doing to affect the election next time, what power do people who would overturn an election have right now, what means would they use. I do think that's all correct. But to say it was the way they're framing their hearings was misguided or something, whatever I said, well, that was wrong. People in my business make mistakes. And I think that was a mistake. And they've clearly exceeded my expectations. And frankly, the evidence has exceeded my expectations. What we learned last week about some of the things Donald Trump said. I've made a few mistakes over the last 5 years, and they've always been to overestimate Donald Trump. This is a losing proposition. Never
You're not alone in that.
Yeah.
You are not alone in that.
He's capable of, I think the shocking thing to me, the really eye-opening thing that we learned he allegedly said was that as the crowd is marching toward the Capitol, he knows they're armed. He wants to take out the metal detectors. In other words, he wants to give armed insurgents access to the US Capitol. If he really said that, that is, I don't know if it's a smoking gun, but it's pretty close to one.
Let's go to some questions from our viewers. Let's see. Sid asks, if faith in attending religious services helps us act better, how to explain the intolerance of the religious right?
Fair point. Yeah, so my observation is that for all religious, and I'm a person of faith, but for all the people of faith talk about the good, their behavior should be a lot better than people who are secular. And their behavior is not that much better. It's pretty much indistinguishable. My religious friends are probably no better than my atheist friends. I will say a couple things about the religious right, specifically about Christian nationalism. One of the things that struck me is that Christian nationalists are nationalists. I'm not sure they're Christian. And so the nationalism has become very strong. The Christian formation has become weak. And so I have a pastor friend of mine who smuggles lines from the Sermon on the Mount into his sermons without saying where they came from. And afterwards, people come up to him and say, I really liked your sermon, except for that part. That was so woke. I didn't agree with that. And so what's happened in a lot of pulpits is that the faith has become minimized and politics has become maximized. And my own view is that when you leave people, as I think has happened in this culture, without a system of moral values, they're going to find whatever moral values are close at home. And so they're going to go to politics. And politics offers you a clear system of moral values. There's the good guys, our team, and there's the bad guys, their team. Politics offers you the illusion of belonging. We're all part of a community on Team Red. But it's not really a community because it's not based on actual interaction with people. It's just we all hate the same thing. So it's the illusion of community. And it offers you a sense of righteousness. We're fighting for the good. And all you have to do is, you don't have to serve the poor or help the widow. All you got to do is be on the right side. And so we've become vastly over politicized. And I think politics has filled the moral vacuum.
Well, and I about abortion specifically, because Sid raises in his question the example of repeal of Roe v. Wade. And one of the problems with abortion is that Americans have rather nuanced views on it. And they may not be even fully thought through about all the different permutations that are involved. And often the rhetoric that we hear is from the extremes on abortion. So on one side, you have people talking about, well, the fetus is just a collection of cells, which is an offensive statement to a person of faith who believes that post-conception, that it is life, not just a collection of cells. I mean, we're all collections of cells, but then on the other hand, you have people who are advocating for what they say is the right of the unborn, with disregard to the real life circumstances of people that are carrying that fetus. So, part of this, to me, what's so disconcerting is it's a fake debate. It's not really the conversations that we're having as people. It's disconnected from that.
Yeah, I think the majority, and polls show this clearly, the polls show two things. One, the majority, about 57%, supported Roe v. Wade and 41% opposed. But if you ask them, when should abortion be legal, the majority thinks somewhere in the middle there. And I'll just say my own opinion. I don't know when the soul enters a body. I do think at some point a soul enters a fetus and it becomes a human being, capable of thought, pain, listening to its mother, laughing. When does that happen? Don't know. It's a mystery to me. To me, it's not a conception, but it's also not at the birth canal. And so it's somewhere in the middle. And to me, if we lived in a normal country, we would say, let's respect both those points of view and let's settle at something in the middle. And I look over at Europe. Europe doesn't have big civil wars about abortion. They've got laws. I think in France, it's about 16 weeks. I think in Sweden, it's 18 weeks. I think in Germany, it's effectively 12 weeks. But they've got something in the middle there. And it's a thing that probably a lot of people on either end is not completely happy with, but it's about where the consensus is. And one of the constancies in our political life right now is that majorities do not rule, that angry minorities rule of the left and right. And in institution after institution that I'm in, that the majority of people want to behave in a certain way. They don't want canceling. They don't want some Tucker Carlson culture war. And yet it's hard for them to get their point across. And it's hard for this reason. The people who want the Tucker Carlson culture war, they're really loud and proud. And everyone else says, just don't want to get involved.
Rick,
and so they retreat to silence.
Rick asks, do you think the rise of technology has contributed to a decline of interpersonal skills and the degradation of tolerance? I remember you saying you didn't feel the technology was the prompter for this, that sort of this is more basic human defaults. But could it be that our ability to navigate social situations has declined?
Yeah, I do think that's true. I think technology plays a role. It's not the only thing, but I think it's played a role. And so to me, one of the things I notice in my coverage of the country is an epidemic of blindness. It's people feeling they're unseen. And that's Blacks feeling their daily experiences are not understood by whites. That's people in rural America feeling they're not seen by coastal elites. That's Republicans and Democrats looking at each other in incomprehension. That's lonely high school kids feeling that nobody sees them. They feel insulted and humiliated. And some small minority of them do these horrible shootings. And so people just feel unseen. And I think one of the causes of that is that we are born to have thick communication, a thick conversation, sitting around a coffee table, sitting around a diner. That's like a normal conversation. Instagram and TikTok, that's very thin communication. That's really not even communication, it's just performance. And so if you live your life on those modalities, then you're going to have a bunch of social relationships, which are not really relationships. They're just a bunch of performances and competitive performances. And you're going to feel alienated and you're going to feel somewhat isolated from each other. And there's nothing worse than isolation and anxiety to produce a lot of sense of fear.
Deborah in Sydney, Australia asks, what do you think will be the effect of the Dobbs decision?
Well, the short answer is I really don't know. Because I'll say this, when Roe happened in the early 70s, I would not have predicted in 1973 that what Roe would do. It's important to remember when Roe happened, a lot of the big pro-choice groups were Republicans. It was Republican governors doing this. It was Barry Goldwater who wanted people to have abortion rights. And the people who were more pro-life were Ted Kennedy and some of the Catholic progressives. And so what Roe did is it totally bifurcated our politics. And in my view, it led to 30 or 40 years of Republican rule. I don't think Ronald Reagan would have been elected without pro-life voters. I don't think George W. Bush would have been elected without pro-life voters. I certainly don't think Donald Trump would have been elected without pro-life voters. These are people who are single issue voters who may be with the Democrats on economic policy, but abortion is their issue. And so now you take that issue and move it to the states. It's completely plausible to me. It will be, just politically speaking, set aside the morals, politically speaking, a boon to the Democratic Party long-term, because suddenly abortion will not be a federal issue, it'll be a state issue, and people will be free to vote on other issues for federal offices. Having said that, I think that might be a likely long-term outcome. In the short term, it's going to be extremely confusing as states pass laws, don't pass laws, courts turn them down, don't turn them down. We're going to be in a period of real chaos on this issue for some period of time.
Do you think that the outrage over the decision will fuel Democrats to turn out in greater numbers, and that it will advantage Democrats who don't traditionally vote based on the Supreme Court, but this time out very, very well may?
So far, if you look at the evidence, there's been a small uptick. So before the Dobbs decision, if you ask people, who do you want to vote for, Republicans or Democrats in Congress, the Republicans had a slight advantage. Post-Dobbs, Democrats now have a slight advantage. So there's clearly been some effect to mobilize Democratic voters. Will that effect last? I guess color me skeptical. I think this election is going to be about the economy. And 83% of Americans say the economy is poor. 83% of Americans say the country is going in the wrong direction. Those are just massive numbers. And so if the economy stays the way it is, then I think that's just going to be the dominant issue in the fall. And it's probably bad news for Democrats. Good news for Democrats is that there is some sign that inflation is about to come down. Energy prices seem to be collapsing on global markets, and that may show up on the gas stations in a little while. And if energy prices come down, then a lot of prices begin to come down. And so the economy and inflation rates may look a lot better in November than they do right now. That's possible.
Gabriella asks, what is your assessment of DeSantis? Is he just a smarter Trump?
I don't think so. I think he's smarter than Trump, he's not my cup of tea, but he's not. Trump is in my view, an acid on the institutions of government. He simply does not believe in the democratic norms of government. He regarded the White House basically as a personal kingship, and he undermined the institutions of our government. And in my view, if he served 4 more years, it would have a catastrophic effect on the institutions of our government and our democracy, and on public morality. DeSantis, you can agree with him or not agree with him. He's way more of a culture warrior than I want to. He picks these fights with Disney and stuff like that I think are fundamentally silly, but that's the Republican playbook right now. But I think he's fundamentally not a menace to the institutions of government the way Donald Trump is. So I don't think he's just a smarter Donald Trump.
Lynn asks, how do you analyze the upsurge in crime in Chicago? It appears jaw-droppingly huge.
And not only in Chicago, in New York and Washington. And it started out as a series of violent crimes. And it was just gun violence that was really shooting up. But now it's burglary, it's car hijackings. The rising crime rate is just a massive issue. I can tell you in my neighborhoods in Washington, we feel it every day. We feel the change. My friends in New York, they feel it every day. And so how to explain that? I guess a couple things. I do think police, after the events of the last couple of years, sat back on their heels. And I think they said, we're not going to risk if it's going to destroy our lives. Now, the punishment for the people who did what happened to George Floyd is absolutely right. The discussion we've had and continue to have about seeing policing through the lens of racial justice is absolutely right. But we also need to see policing through the lens of public safety. And I think for a year or so there, we got a little over in one direction, was just racial justice, which is important, but we also need to see through public safety and what kind of policing is going to produce safe streets and for our kids. And I do think there was a bit of withdrawal from that. And second, COVID, all the things we've talked about, just a general sense of social breakdown and a sense of opportunity. There's always going to be some small minority in every community who are going to take advantage to steal things, to carjack, to do things like that. And if they're not, and if they're surrounded by social chaos, there's just more room to do that kind of stuff. If they're surrounded by economic insecurity, there's just more room to do that sort of stuff.
David,
so I would say social decay in policing.
David, when it comes to criminal justice reform, which is not just a Democratic issue, but there are many Republicans who also support criminal justice reform, so much of that hinges on the ability to provide rehabilitative services, repeated drug treatment programs, because as we know, often the first 1, 2, 3 times don't work. It requires a level of delivering resources to people who have crossed paths with the criminal justice system that we've never really done before. Are we societally capable of doing that and undergirding real reform?
Yeah, one of the ways the police department screwed up, not in every jurisdiction, but in many, is they decided they were at war with the community. And so they built up all this military hardware. And, I was a police reporter. I know how cops talk. And there's an ethos where it's us versus them. And that's just not an ethos that's going to work for communities, especially given historical injustices. So that's one thing. But can we have police who are doing the rehabilitation, who are dealing with mental health issues. I've seen it. You know, my wife did a story and my friend made a movie called Ernie and Joe. It's about two cops in San Antonio. And they are sort of mental health crisis cops. And so they come to your door when there's somebody maybe contemplating suicide. Maybe there's a domestic dispute. And they're not there to pull a gun and to be, you know, to go back to our subject, to be authoritarian. They're there to be counselors. And in the movie, Ernie and Joe, you see them talking somebody off a bridge that she's going to throw herself off of. You see them handling domestic disputes. You see them with a sensitivity to mental health issues, which undergird a lot of these problems, or just to people having stressful, bad days. And Ernie and Joe now travel around the country, and they're not the only ones. They're part of a movement, making police forces more sensitive to the vagaries of mental health issues and how they can be resolved. And so I've seen it work well. It just has to be exported to an industry that has often been a little too macho, maybe, for understandable reasons.
And I guess I was talking about people who've, you know, been incarcerated or who've committed crimes, and then obviously their life is off track, and helping them. So beyond that sort of first encounter with someone in crisis, how you deal with someone who's already lived several years of a life involving crime or violence, and the challenge with dealing with that.
Yeah. Well, again, I've seen the solution. So I was in Salt Lake City. I've been there a few times at a place called the Other Side Academy. The Other Side Academy takes men and women out of prison who've served hard time, 25 years. And they come, they move in, they live in a facility, they work in a moving company. And so the best moving company in Salt Lake City is called the Other Side Movers. Their slogan is, we used to take stuff out of your window, now we take it out the door. And so they are ex-cons who are fantastic movers. And they're not only movers, they have a sense of what they call 200% accountability. These guys, men and women, look at each other and they make sure they behave with character. And they have a thing at night called games. And if somebody has not done the job right, if they didn't pay attention when they were packing up somebody's prescription drugs, if they checked out a woman when they were moving her, the peers call each other to account and say, no, that's not the way we behave here. And I have never seen an organization that turned around lives as dramatically. People come into that organization hollow-eyed, broken, fearful, and sometimes vicious. 2 years later, they're upstanding members of the community.
Thanks. Thanks for the idea. We'll do a segment on my daily program about them, because that's
I would
remarkable.
love to connect you. There's some
That would be
amazing
great.
people there.
Yeah. Real quickly, I want to get another question in, but we've got to be a quick response. Leslie asks, what's your assessment of where the Russian-Ukraine war will end? Will our new weapons make a difference? Real quickly.
Well, we have to give them more. Our weapons are making a difference. The long-range missiles, the artillery. The Russians just are skilled at grinding things down. But our weapons, as we've seen in the last week, are beginning to make a difference. And there is a certain time, as Winston Churchill said, I'm not going to use his exact words because it's not polite, but you just have to keep grinding. And if the Ukrainians just keep grinding and we continue to support them as we are supporting them, and maybe more, I still have quite a bit of hope the Ukrainians will be in a good position a year from now.
In wrapping up, David, I just want to ask you real briefly, we got like 45 seconds. Where do you see hopefulness to bring us together past our biases, past our suspicion of our fellow Americans, to help find greater commonality and to avoid an undemocratic term?
Yeah, in these weavers, I go around the country. I go to a neighborhood in Nebraska and North Carolina and California, and you say, who's trusted here? And people in the neighborhood point to the same 6 people, and you spend time with them. The rest of the world's been depressed, but I spend time with the weavers, and I'm like, this is great country. It's filled with great people. And so those are the people that give me hope, the people who are working on the ground in the neighborhoods they live in, to build trust and to build community, and to build really warm relationships.
David, thank you so much. I really appreciate your talking about all the subjects that we did over the course of this hour. It's great to see you again, and thank you for being a critical part of America at a Crossroads this year. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be part of this community again. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Next week, Bill Browder, author of the New York Times bestseller, Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, state-sponsored murder, and Putin's wrath. KCRW's Warren Only will interview Browder. That's next Wednesday at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Also, please contribute to support these important programs. The two nonprofit organizations that put these on are Jews United for Democracy and Justice. You can go to that organization's website or Community Advocates, Inc. to make your contribution to support these programs. We appreciate it very much, and you'll see right there on the screen the websites where you can make your tax-deductible contribution. Thank you very much. Next week's program I know will be terrific. Have a great evening.